Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to be going over the Details tab as well as the Lens Correction and Transform tab, as also probably the Effects tab. The reason we're going to be doing all these in one video is they're relatively straightforward and it won't take too long to explain what's going on. So let's dive right into it. First, we've got our Detail tab here. Now, this is where you're going to be adding all your sharpening effects and your noise reduction. So I usually don't add too much sharpening to the images because I don't want it to have that over-processed look that you tend to get on like phone cameras where everything just looks way overly sharpened. But a nice little tip that you can do if you just zoom in here, if you do bring up the sharpening, you can see how it's kind of sharpening everything here. So you see it in the details on her skin, and it's kind of making this weird sort of pattern, especially in the background here, this noisy pattern. So you're not going to obviously want that. So we're going to leave this at the default 40. And the masking is where we're going to be bringing in most of our sharpening. So what this is going to allow us to do is essentially just sharpen not specific areas, the edges of our scene and what's in focus. So if you actually hold Alt, as we talked about before, if you hold Alt on masking, you'll see that we'll get this white and black looking mask, and as you drag it towards the right, everything that's white is what's going to be affected by the sharpening, and everything that's black is not. So this is a great way to just keep the details here staying, like getting some new sharpening, and leaving sort of the details like in the folds and whatnot that aren't as important, that don't need to be sharpened, leave those completely out. So we could just drag up our sharpening, and you'll see that if we take our mask off, we've got everything, and as we pull it towards the right side here, it's only going to sharpen kind of the edges of what is already sharp from our lens. So a cool little nifty trick. Personally, when I'm doing sharpness, I don't really add a whole lot. I'll probably just add a little bit of masking, and I'll keep the sharpness at default. But you can go in and add more if you like. Sometimes your focus might miss and you'll have to add a little bit more sharpening. Now you can also add sharpening via the filters up here, but we will talk about that in a future video. Now next we have our luminance and noise reduction. So if you slide this, you'll notice that it kind of softens the edges. Now the rule of thumb for the luminance under our noise reduction is you don't want it to be any more than the amount of megapixels on your camera. So I believe my camera is 21 or 23. I think it's 21 megapixels. So I would just bring it to 21. And that would give us a little bit of smoothing. And then I would go in and add back my sharpening. So you can kind of use these two here to push and pull. Now I don't really use the color, detail, and smoothness all that much. You can play with these. They're very, very subtle sort of effects going on. As you can see, like I'm playing with these sliders right now and I really don't notice anything changing on my image. But if you do hold Alt, you'll get again like a grayscale mask of what's going on. Now underneath we have our color, detail, and smoothness. More sliders that I personally don't really use, but you can play with them to just kind of see the small details that they'll add. But again, everything here is just mainly for sharpening. So next we have our lens correction. So this is a pretty cool one because you can remove your chromatic aberration here. Now for those who don't know what chromatic aberration is, I can show you with an image kind of like this. So you can see on this guy here, this sort of purple fringing going on when usually happens when a light surface meets a dark surface. So the the sort of reflectiveness of his shirt meeting the dark background, your sensor kind of gets a little jumbled up, and it kind of makes these sort of fringing effects on the side. Now, just checking remove chromatic aberration can do a little bit of correction, but you might have to go into manual, where you can actually, we'll just go in 200% here, where you can even hit the defringe, and if we click right here, you'll notice that it will do its best to correct that. But keep in mind that since his shirt kind of falls in the same color palette as the fringe, it can kind of decolor a little bit of his shirt as well. But you can, of course, change the amount as you wish. And you can see as I'm on 0, fully fringed, and as I bring this up, it sort of disappears. Now, I've also noticed that you can get rid of a little bit of chromatic aberration fringing within your saturation. So, it's usually in the purple and magentas. So if you bring those down, it can get rid of quite a bit of the fringing as well, basically by just desaturating that color. But you have to be careful because there is a push and pull to it. As you probably noticed, it took out a little bit of color in his cheeks, and that's not what you want to do. So that's pretty much it for the chromatic aberration. It's a very interesting tool. I definitely suggest just playing around with it. There's a few different sliders here. Personally, I just use the dropper, and it does a pretty good job at kind of getting the ballpark of what you need. But you can see the dramatic difference some of these sliders actually make by essentially cutting off those magenta colors from your scene completely. So we're just going to hit Control Z on that because we don't want that. And we'll just bring our amount down and just bring that back. So that's under manual, of course. We also have our distortion, but this is mainly for our image as a whole. It really has nothing to do with chromatic aberration, which is why I don't really understand why it's under this section, but it is. So you can kind of see if I just go to fit, you'll see the distortion is literally distorting our image. You can use this to create some cool like fisheye effects if you want, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'll just put it back to what it was at before, 0. All right, and we've got our straight lines again. So that's pretty much it for our chromatic aberration. Next, we have our lens profile correction. So if we click this, it's going to essentially try and map your lens. Now, I do notice if you're using drones, it has a hard time mapping the correct lens, especially the Mavic Pro 2. It can't actually search a lens, but I think there is an actual, if you go to DJI, Mavic Pro, and Mavic Pro, so that's the closest one that you can get, but there isn't like a specific Mavic Pro or Mavic Pro 2 lens profile. But essentially what this is going to do is just fix some distortion. Now this is a Sony lens, so just actually just Control Z. I don't want to go through and find that again. This is a Sony lens, the 50mm 1.8. I noticed that whenever I hit lens correction, it really just brightens up the edges here. Kind of like, it's almost like without it, there's just a vignette. But I do notice that if I use things like my Tamron 17-28 lens, then it actually fixes a little bit of distortion in lines. So things might be like, if you take a shot of like a city where you've got a lot of buildings in the background, you see these are like tilted to the side, but you'll get some tilted this way, and then on this side of the image you'll get them tilted the other way. This can help kind of even those out so they're straight along, like across the board. So yeah, something to play around with. Definitely a useful feature. And of course you have your distortion and vignette down here if you want to control that yourself. You can actually control the amount of distortion and vignette that you have on your photo. I'm not quite sure why distortion is not really doing anything right now, but it usually does similar to what this this distortion does here. So we're just going to uncheck that. And next we have our transform. So pretty straightforward. These are great for just quickly lining up your image. If you hit auto here, it's going to automatically try and line up our straight edges to make sure everything is straight in our scene. But you can also see that it didn't crop in our image. It just tilted it to the side, so you'll have to manually crop yourself. You can also constrain your crop where it will actually crop in. And of course you have your sort of warping distortion tools here. So you can actually use these distortion tools here to either create cool effects or just try and get those sort of lines to straighten up for you. You've got multiple. This kind of works like if you've used Photoshop's transform. You can get like perspective or warp transform. These are kind of a similar thing, but just a little bit less powerful. You have different options here too: guided, level, vertical, and full. They all just use essentially a different algorithm to try and straighten out your image. Personally, I really don't use these too much. I find it's more beneficial to just go in and manually crop our image And whoops, go all the way back. Yeah, to manually crop our image, you go like this, and then you can crop it yourself. But people do use these transform tools all the same. Now, next we've got our effects. So this is where you're going to be adding your vignette or your grain. So if we, of course, drag our amount to the left, we're going to get a black vignette. And if we grab it to the right, we're going to get a white vignette. So we'll just do, we're going to do a rather dark vignette just for the tutorial's sake, because we can also adjust the midpoint, where we can make it more center, or less of a vignette. We can also adjust our roundness if we want something that's more of a square or a rectangle fitting our frame, or something that's more circular in the middle. And we can also adjust our feather if we would like it to be like a hard circle. I don't know, maybe you're like designing a picture frame or something, or if you want something very, very feathered out where it's kind of just highlighting the middle of your frame here. And actually, I'll just go like this so you can kind of see how it's actually affecting. That's a little bit better, because this is probably what you'll be seeing once you crop your photo, where you want the vignette to be highlighting your subject. Now you can also achieve the same effect with the eclipse filter, but we'll go over that again when we cover the eclipse filter. Just going to go back down here. And we have, of course, our highlights, which essentially just allows the highlights of your image to kind of poke through the vignette. So cool little feature. Personally, don't really use it too much. When I'm doing the vignette, really all I do is add a tiny vignette, and I really don't even play with the feather all that much. Something like this at most. But yeah, that's pretty much it for our vignette. And lastly, we're going to be covering our grain. So I actually have a nice grain that I used, and you can actually copy this if you would like. I find this is just a really nice overall grain. Doesn't look too noisy. And you can, of course, adjust the amount of grain if you would like more of it. And you can adjust the size of your grain if you want a very, very sort of, if you've got that Polaroid vintage look, you might want a very heavy grain, because that's what that sort of camera produces. Or you can make it look even noisy if you want a small grain. Now the roughness, exactly that, kind of the strength or the contrast of the grain. So this here kind of looks like a noisy flat grain. And when you push it to this side, it looks more like a bolder sort of grain that has some depth to it. So again, I've got my own grain. I saved out my own tools that essentially just give me a grain. I can also turn it off just like so. And you can save these as presets if you would like. But that is essentially it for using these tools here. Lastly, we're going to be covering the calibration. So again, a very, very powerful tool. We're going to be color correcting this photo, and I'm going to be showing you how you can get that really cool teal and orange look quickly with the camera calibration. Now, this feature is awesome because it doesn't actually exist in the other version of Lightroom. So with that said, I'll catch you guys in the next one.